The sun dipped low over the sleepy town of Meadowbrook, casting the suburban streets in golden hues. It was the kind of place where the biggest excitement came from backyard barbecues or the occasional neighborhood gossip. For years, Meadowbrook had been a quiet sanctuary, where families left their doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes until sunset, and everyone knew everyone else. That peace was shattered the day the iron vultures roared into town. The first sign of trouble was the distant growl of motorcycle engines, a deep, guttural rumble that echoed through the hills like a storm on the horizon. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable above the sounds of birds chirping and children laughing, but as the engines drew closer, the noise became more menacing. The deep, throaty roars of Harley-Davidsons cut through the calm evening air like knives, sending a chill down the spines of Meadowbrook's residents. People peeked out of their windows, pulling back curtains with cautious hands. Nervous glances were exchanged between neighbors as the sound grew louder, reverberating off the quiet houses. At the far end of Maplewood Drive, in a modest clapboard house with a neatly manicured lawn, William Bill Carter sat by the window, sipping his evening tea. He was 97 years old, but his steel-gray eyes were sharp as ever, scanning the street with the vigilance of a man who had seen too much of life to ever let his guard down. Bill had fought in World War II, landing on the beaches of Normandy and surviving the brutal winter in the Ardennes. He had stared death in the face more times than he cared to remember, and had returned home a decorated hero. But war left its mark on a man, and though the years had softened his features and slowed his step, the fire inside him never waned. As the growl of motorcycles drew closer, Bill's grip tightened around the handle of his cane, the faint click of his wedding ring against the wood echoing in the quiet room. "Grandpa?" came a soft voice from behind him. Bill turned to see his granddaughter, Sarah, standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her blue eyes wide with concern. Behind her, two small children peeked nervously from around her legs, her son, Tommy, and her daughter, Lily. They were just 7 and 5 years old, far too young to understand the tension in the air, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. "They're back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Bill nodded slowly, his expression calm but resolute. "I know, sweetheart." "They've been harassing people all week," Sarah continued, stepping closer. "First at the gas station, then at the diner. Now they're cruising through the neighborhoods. Some people say they're squatting in that old abandoned warehouse by the highway." Bill didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned back to the window, watching as the first of the motorcycles came into view. There were at least a dozen riders, their bikes gleaming in the fading sunlight. They rode slowly, deliberately, as if marking their territory. Their leather vests bore the patch of a grinning skull with wings, the unmistakable insignia of the iron vultures. Bill's jaw tightened. "They're getting bolder," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't think they're just passing through anymore. They're settling in." Bill set his cup down with deliberate care, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. He rose from his chair with a groan, his movements slow but purposeful. His cane tapped against the hardwood floor as he walked to the front door, where his old military jacket hung on a hook. He took it down, running his fingers over the worn fabric, the metals pinned to the chest glinting faintly in the dim light. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" Sarah asked, panic creeping into her voice. Bill didn't answer. He slipped the jacket on, adjusting the collar before picking up his cane once more. "They've been pushing their luck for too long," he said, his voice steady. "It's time someone reminded them that this town doesn't belong to them." "Wait!" Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "You can't go out there. They're dangerous." Bill met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "So am I." Sarah's grip loosened, her expression torn between fear and admiration. She knew her grandfather wasn't a man to be trifled with. He had faced far worse than a group of rowdy bikers. But this wasn't the battlefield anymore. This was their home, their family. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. "Please," she whispered, "at least wait for the sheriff. Let the police handle it." Bill shook his head. The sheriff's got his hands full. Besides, by the time he gets here, those bastards will have done their damage and ridden off. Sarah glanced out the window, watching as the bikers dismounted from their bikes, laughing and hollering as they tossed beer bottles onto the lawns. One of them, a tall, burly man with a thick beard and a leather vest covered in patches, kicked over a mailbox, his laughter echoing down the street. Bill's grip on his cane tightened. "Take the kids to the back room," he said softly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say it's safe." "Grandpa?" "Go, Sarah." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded. She gathered her children and hurried them down the hall, casting one last worried glance over her shoulder before disappearing into the back of the house. Bill stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening air brushing against his weathered face. He took a deep breath, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the acrid smell of exhaust fumes. The street was eerily quiet now, save for the sound of the bikers laughing and shouting. "Hey!" Bill's voice cut through the noise like a knife. The bikers turned, their laughter abruptly silenced. They stared at the old man standing on the porch, his military jacket buttoned up, his cane tapping steadily against the wooden boards. The leader of the gang, the tall, burly man with the beard, stepped forward, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who we have here. Gramps decided to come out and play." Bill didn't flinch. "This is my street. You're not welcome here." The leader chuckled, glancing back at his crew. "You hear that, boys? The old man thinks he owns the place." The bikers burst into laughter, their voices harsh and grating. But the leader's smirk faded when he noticed the steely resolve in Bill's eyes, the gaze of a man who had seen death and lived to tell the tale. "Go home, old man," the leader said, his tone hardening, "before you get yourself hurt." Bill took a step forward, descending the porch steps with slow, deliberate movements. His cane tapped against the pavement, each step echoing through the quiet street. "You've been harassing people in this town for weeks," Bill said, his voice steady. "Threatening families, intimidating shop owners. It ends now." The leader's eyes narrowed. "And what are you going to do about it? Beat us with your cane?" Bill's lips curved into a faint smile. "Something like that." Without breaking eye contact, Bill reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a weathered harmonica. The sight caught the bikers off guard, confusion flickering across their faces. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered. Bill raised the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The low, mournful tune filled the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. It was a melody he had learned during the war, a song that had carried him through the darkest nights, through fear and uncertainty. As he played, movement stirred in the shadows. From the edges of the street, figures began to emerge, men of varying ages, some older, some younger, all carrying the unmistakable bearing of those who had seen battle. They wore faded military jackets and carried an assortment of tools, baseball bats, shovels, and even cane swords. The gang's confidence wavered as the men surrounded them. "You picked the wrong neighborhood," Bill said, lowering the harmonica. Frank, one of Bill's old war buddies, stepped up beside him, a grin on his face. "We've been waiting for this." The bikers glanced around, realizing too late that they were outnumbered and outmatched. For the first time, fear flickered in the leader's eyes. The leader of the Iron Vultures, Earl Grizzly Barnes, scowled as he surveyed the growing crowd of men emerging from the shadows. His bravado wavered as he counted more than a dozen figures, weathered faces, hardened expressions, and slow, deliberate movements that spoke of experience in battlefields far more dangerous than a suburban street. Some of the men carried old rifles, slung over their shoulders like relics of a past life. Others wielded tools repurposed as weapons, bats with nails driven into them, crowbars, even a pair of brass knuckles that glinted menacingly in the streetlights. But it wasn't the weapons that made Grizzly uneasy. It was the look in their eyes. These weren't ordinary civilians. These were men who had seen war, who had survived it, and who weren't afraid to fight again. "Grizzly!" one of the younger bikers whispered, his voice shaky. "What do we do?" Grizzly turned and snarled at him. "Shut up! We've got this!" But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. They'd expected to terrorize a quiet neighborhood, shake down some easy marks, and leave with their pockets full and their egos inflated. Instead, they found themselves staring down a wall of veterans, men who had faced death and lived to tell the tale. Grizzly tried to reassert control, stepping forward with an exaggerated swagger. "So, what's the plan here, Grandpa?" he sneered, addressing Bill, You and your buddies gonna lecture us on honor and duty? Maybe sing us a war song." Bill didn't flinch. He stood tall, his cane planted firmly on the ground. The medals on his military jacket glinted in the harsh light, a silent testament to a life of service and sacrifice. "No lectures," Bill said. His voice was calm, measured. "Just a warning." Grizzly chuckled, though it sounded forced. "A warning, huh? And what if we don't take it?" Bill took a slow step forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. The sound echoed through the street, each step deliberate, each tap a reminder of his unwavering resolve. "Then you'll find out what happens when you mess with men who have nothing left to lose," Bill said. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The bikers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado cracking under the weight of Bill's calm authority. One of the bikers, a young, wiry man with tattoos creeping up his neck, scoffed. "This is a joke, right? You old-timers think you're still in the war?" Frank, Bill's longtime friend and fellow veteran, stepped up beside him. He was a tall man, his posture still upright despite his age. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who had seen more than his fair share of violence. "We've seen worse than you," Frank said quietly. "And we're still here?" Grizzly's eyes darted between Bill and Frank, then to the other veterans surrounding them. He could feel the tide turning, the fear creeping into his crew. The Iron Vultures weren't used to being challenged, especially not by men old enough to be their grandfathers. "Enough of this," Grizzly growled. "We didn't come here to chat." With a flick of his wrist, he signaled to his crew. The younger bikers revved their engines, the roar of their motorcycles cutting through the tense silence. The sound was meant to intimidate, but it only served to underscore the divide between the two groups, the bikers, brash and reckless, and the veterans, steady and unyielding. "You've got two choices," Bill said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Leave now and never come back, or stay and find out what happens when you push men too far." Grizzly sneered. "You think you can scare us, old man?" Bill didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He flipped it open, revealing names scrawled in neat handwriting, names of men he had served with, men who had fought and died beside him. "This," Bill said, holding up the notebook, "is a list of men I've lost. Brothers, friends, men who gave everything for their country. I'm still standing because of them." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. There was something in Bill's voice, a quiet strength, a resolve that couldn't be shaken. Frank stepped forward again, his gaze locked on Grizzly. "We've fought for this country, we've bled for it, and we sure as hell aren't gonna let a bunch of punks come in here and tear it apart." Grizzly's confidence faltered. He could see it in the eyes of the veterans, the unwavering determination, the quiet defiance. These weren't men who would back down. They were men who had already faced the worst the world had to offer and survived. But Grizzly wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Fine," he said, forcing a grin. "We'll go, but don't think for a second that this is over." Bill's expression didn't change. "We'll be waiting." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life. One by one, they sped off into the night, their bravado deflated. But as the last bike disappeared down the street, Bill knew it wasn't the end. "They'll be back," Frank said, his voice low. Bill nodded. "I know." The next morning, the sun rose over Meadowbrook, casting a warm glow over the quiet streets. But the peace was deceptive. The events of the night before lingered in the minds of the residents, the tension palpable. Bill stood on his porch, his cane in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other. He watched as his neighbors went about their morning routines, their movements cautious and wary. The Iron Vultures had shaken them, disrupted the sense of safety that had always defined Meadowbrook. Frank joined him on the porch, a newspaper tucked under his arm. "Looks like the sheriff finally decided to show up," he said, nodding toward a patrol car parked at the end of the street. Sheriff Tom Wheeler stepped out of the car, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He was a middle-aged man with a weary expression, the weight of responsibility etched into his features. He approached the porch, his footsteps heavy on the gravel driveway. "Morning, Bill, Frank," the sheriff said with a nod. "Morning, Sheriff," Bill replied. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Heard there was some trouble last night." Bill sipped his coffee, his gaze steady. "You heard right." The sheriff sighed. "We've had reports about the Iron Vultures for weeks. They've been causing trouble all over the county. We've been stretched thin trying to keep up with them." Frank crossed his arms over his chest. "Well, they're here now. What are you planning to do about it?" The sheriff hesitated. "We're doing what we can, but these guys aren't your average troublemakers. They're organized, dangerous." "So are we," Bill said quietly. The sheriff glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "Bill, I know you're capable, but this isn't your fight." Bill's gaze hardened. "It is now." The sheriff shook his head. "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want anyone getting hurt. Let us handle it." Bill didn't respond. He simply turned his attention back to the street, watching as his neighbors went about their day, their movements still tinged with unease. "This town has always taken care of its own," Bill said after a long pause. "We're not about to change that now. The Iron Vultures may have left for now, but the battle for Meadowbrook was far from over. Bill and his fellow veterans knew what was coming. The bikers would return, more determined than ever to stake their claim, but they also knew something the Iron Vultures didn't: the strength of a community united, the power of men who had nothing left to lose. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Bill stood on his porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Iron Vultures didn't stay gone for long. By mid-afternoon the next day, the distant roar of motorcycles echoed through the hills again, this time louder and more deliberate. Bill was back on his porch, his cane resting against the arm of his chair, his sharp gaze locked on the road. The sound made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He'd heard that sound before, back in the war, when the distant rumble of tanks signaled incoming trouble. Only this time, it wasn't tanks. It was a gang of men who thought they could intimidate his town. Frank appeared beside him, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. His weathered face was set in a determined scowl. "They're coming back," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Bill nodded. "And they're bringing more this time." Across the street, more of the veterans were gathering, their expressions grim. Word had spread quickly about what had happened the night before. Men who had once fought side by side in distant lands were now coming together again, not as soldiers, but as protectors of their community. Frank tapped the baseball bat against his palm. "You think they'll come straight down Maplewood?" Bill shook his head. "No, they'll spread out. Try to cover more ground." Frank grunted in agreement. "They think they've got us outnumbered." "They always do," Bill replied with a faint smile, "until they don't." The veterans began to take their positions. Some stood on porches, others took cover behind cars and fences. They weren't armed with guns. Most of them had left their firearms behind years ago. Instead, they wielded whatever they could find: bats, crowbars, garden tools, anything that could be used to send a message. This wasn't a battle of weapons. It was a battle of will. The first motorcycle came into view at the top of the hill, the rider slowing as he reached the entrance to Maplewood Drive. He was followed by another and another, until the street was filled with the deafening roar of engines. The bikers rode slowly, deliberately, their leather vests glinting in the fading sunlight. At the front of the pack was Grizzly, his thick beard blowing in the wind, his eyes scanning the street like a predator searching for prey. He pulled his bike to a stop in the middle of the road, kicking up gravel as he dismounted. His crew followed suit, the engines cutting out one by one until the street was eerily silent. Grizzly took a step forward, his boots crunching on the pavement. "Bill!" he shouted, his voice carrying down the street. "We're back!" Bill stood from his chair, gripping his cane tightly. He descended the porch steps with slow, deliberate movements, his military jacket buttoned up tight. As he stepped onto the lawn, the other veterans followed suit, emerging from their hiding spots like ghosts from the past. Grizzly's smirk faltered as he took in the sight of them. "You brought your little army, huh?" he said, trying to sound amused. "Cute?" Bill didn't respond. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on Grizzly. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "What's the plan, old man?" Snake hissed. "You gonna bore us to death with war stories?" Frank stepped up beside Bill, the baseball bat resting on his shoulder. "You boys don't want to do this." Snake laughed. "And why's that?" "Because you're not ready for what's coming," Frank said quietly. Grizzly's patience snapped. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the sunlight. "I'm done talking," he growled. "We're taking this street. You want to stop us? Try. Grizzly lunged forward, the knife aimed straight at Bill. But Bill was faster than he looked. With a swift movement, he swung his cane, the wood connecting with Grizzly's wrist with a sickening crack. The knife flew from Grizzly's hand, clattering to the pavement. Grizzly stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face twisted in pain and rage. "You son of a..." Before he could finish, Frank stepped in, swinging the baseball bat with practiced ease. The bat connected with Grizzly's ribs, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other bikers surged forward, but the veterans were ready. Frank shouted, "Hold the line!" The street erupted into chaos as the two groups clashed. The veterans fought with the grit and determination of men who had faced death before. They moved with precision, covering each other's backs, using their makeshift weapons with deadly efficiency. The bikers, on the other hand, fought with brute strength and reckless aggression, but they weren't prepared for the discipline and coordination of the veterans. Bill moved through the fray with surprising agility, his cane a blur as he deflected attacks and struck back with unerring accuracy. The fight dragged on, both sides refusing to back down. Bill found himself face to face with Snake, the wiry biker who had taunted him earlier. "You should have stayed inside, old man," Snake hissed, brandishing a crowbar. Bill didn't flinch. "I've faced worse than you." Snake lunged, but Bill sidestepped the attack with ease. He swung his cane, knocking the crowbar from Snake's hand before delivering a swift strike to his kneecap. Snake collapsed with a scream, clutching his leg. "You'll regret this," Snake snarled. Bill leaned in, his voice low. "No, you will." As the battle raged on, it became clear that the bikers were outmatched. They had strength in numbers, but the veterans had something far more powerful: experience, resolve, and a deep bond forged in battle. Grizzly, still clutching his injured wrist, shouted for his crew to regroup. "Fall back!" he bellowed. "Fall back!" The bikers began to retreat, their confidence shattered. But Bill wasn't ready to let them go. "We're not done," he said, his voice carrying over the chaos. Frank stepped up beside him. "What's the plan, Bill?" Bill's gaze was cold. "We send them a message?" The veterans surrounded the remaining bikers, forcing them to drop their weapons. Grizzly glared at Bill, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. "You think this is over?" Grizzly spat. "You think we're just gonna walk away?" Bill stepped forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. "You've already lost." Grizzly's eyes narrowed. "We'll be back, with more men, more firepower." Bill's expression didn't change. "And we'll be waiting." The veterans closed in, their presence imposing. "This is our town," Bill said. "We fought for it, we bled for it, and we'll defend it again." Grizzly sneered. "You're making a mistake." Bill leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "The only mistake would be letting you walk away without understanding who you're dealing with." Grizzly stared at him for a long moment before finally backing down. "Let's go," he growled to his crew. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. One by one, they sped off into the distance, leaving the veterans standing victorious in the street. As the last bike disappeared over the horizon, Frank turned to Bill. "Think they'll come back?" Bill nodded slowly. "They always do." As the veterans gathered to discuss their next steps, Bill stood on his porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The fight was over, for now. But he knew it wasn't the end. The Iron Vultures would return, and when they did, Bill and his brothers in arms would be ready. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the street fell eerily silent. The veterans stood together in the middle of Maplewood Drive, their breathing heavy, their grips tight on their makeshift weapons. The adrenaline that had fueled them moments ago began to ebb, replaced by a quiet, resolute calm. They knew the battle wasn't over. It never was. Bill leaned on his cane, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon where the bikers had disappeared. His face was unreadable, but inside, his mind was working through the next steps. These men weren't cowards. They would regroup, they would return, and next time, they'd come prepared. Frank wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced at Bill. "They'll be back," he said, echoing the thought that hung in the air between them. Bill nodded slowly. "Yes, and next time, they won't just come to intimidate." The other veterans gathered around, their faces grim. Many of them bore the marks of the scuffle, scratches, bruises, bloodied knuckles, but none of them looked ready to back down. These were men who had survived the worst humanity had to offer. They weren't about to be scared off by a gang of thugs. "We need to fortify," Frank said, his voice steady. "They're gonna come back harder. We need to be ready." Bill nodded in agreement. "We've already shown them that we won't roll over, but now we need to make sure they understand that Meadowbrook is off limits." One of the younger veterans, a man named Charlie, stepped forward. He was in his early 60s, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a soldier who had seen combat. "We've got enough men to cover the key points in town," he said. "We can set up a watch system, keep eyes on the roads. If they come back, we'll see them before they get close." "Good," Bill said. "But that's not enough. They're not just going to ride in and cause trouble. They'll try to take this town piece by piece." Frank frowned. "You think they'll start going after businesses?" Bill nodded. "That's what they've done in other towns. They'll start small, extortion, vandalism, and if they think we're weak, they'll escalate." Charlie crossed his arms over his chest. "Then, we don't give them the chance." The group began to strategize, their military instincts kicking in. They discussed shifts for the watch, points of entry into the town, and how best to communicate if trouble arose. They worked quickly and efficiently, the years of discipline and training shining through. This wasn't just a group of old men defending their homes. This was a unit, a band of brothers standing together once again. As the meeting broke up, the men dispersed to their homes, their expressions resolute. Bill lingered on his porch, watching as the last of his comrades disappeared into the night. He felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had been a leader once before, in a far more dangerous situation. But this felt different. This was personal. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with worry. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you can't keep doing this." Bill turned to her, his expression softening. "Doing what?" "Putting yourself in danger," she said, her voice trembling. "These men, they're not like the enemies you faced in the war. They don't have honor. They don't care about rules." Bill sighed and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart, but this isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about this town. These men want to take what doesn't belong to them. And if we don't stand up to them, they'll keep taking." Sarah shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "But what if they hurt you? What if they come after the kids?" Bill's gaze hardened. "That's exactly why I'm doing this, to make sure they don't." Sarah hugged him tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. "I just don't want to lose you." Bill patted her back gently. "You won't, sweetheart. I've lived through worse." As they stood there in the quiet night, the distant sound of a lone motorcycle echoed through the hills. Bill's grip on his cane tightened. The fight was far from over. The days that followed were tense. The veterans took turns patrolling the streets, keeping watch over the entrances to town. They worked quietly and efficiently, blending into the fabric of the community. To the casual observer, Meadowbrook looked as peaceful as ever, but beneath the surface, it was a town on edge. Bill spent most of his time on his porch, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew it was only a matter of time before the iron vultures returned, and when they did, he wanted to be ready. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Charlie approached Bill's house, his expression grim. "We've got movement," he said. "A few of our guys spotted bikers near the old warehouse by the highway." Bill nodded. "That's where they've been squatting." Charlie frowned. "They've got more men now, and they're gathering supplies." Bill's gaze hardened. "They're getting ready for something." Charlie nodded. "We need to act." Bill stood, gripping his cane tightly. "Get the men together. We're going to pay them a visit." That night, a group of veterans gathered near the edge of town, their faces illuminated by the glow of flashlights. They were armed with an assortment of tools, bats, crowbars, wrenches. It wasn't about the weapons. It was about sending a message. Bill stood at the front of the group, his expression calm but determined. "We're not here to start a fight," he said. "We're here to remind them that this town isn't theirs to take." Frank nodded in agreement. "We've got the element of surprise. Let's use it." The group moved quietly through the woods, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. As they approached the old warehouse, they could hear the sound of voices. Laughter, shouting, the clinking of bottles. The iron vultures were inside, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Bill motioned for the group to spread out, surrounding the warehouse. He approached the front door, his cane tapping softly against the ground. With a nod from Frank, he stepped forward and banged on the door with the tip of his cane. The laughter inside stopped abruptly. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Grizzly appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Bill standing there. "You've got some nerve," Grizzly growled. Bill met his gaze without flinching. "So do you." Grizzly stepped outside, his hands clenched into fists. "What do you want, old man?" "I want you to leave," Bill said calmly. "Pack up your things and go. You're not welcome here." Grizzly chuckled darkly. "And if we don't?" Bill's gaze hardened. "Then you'll find out what happens when you push men too far." Grizzly's grin faded. He glanced around, noticing for the first time the figures emerging from the shadows. The veterans stood silently, their expressions cold and unyielding. "You think you can scare us?" Grizzly sneered. Frank stepped forward, a wrench in his hand. "We're not trying to scare you. We're trying to give you a way out." Grizzly's eyes darted between the men, calculating his odds. He was outnumbered, and he knew it, but he wasn't ready to back down. "This isn't over," he growled. Bill nodded slowly. "You're right. It's not." Grizzly took a step back, his gaze never leaving Bill's. "We'll be back, and next time, we'll bring more." Bill's expression didn't change. "Bring whoever you want. We'll be waiting." Grizzly turned and disappeared back into the warehouse. A moment later, the sound of motorcycles roared to life, and the bikers began to ride away, their engines echoing through the night. As the last bike disappeared into the distance, Frank turned to Bill. "You think that's the last we'll see of them?" Bill shook his head. "No, they'll be back." Frank frowned. "What do we do now?" Bill's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "We prepare." The wind whispered through the trees as the bikers' engines faded into the distance. The warehouse stood empty now, its once threatening presence reduced to a hollow shell. But the quiet of the night did nothing to ease the tension that gripped the air. Bill stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes fixed on the road where the iron vultures had vanished. His fingers gripped the head of his cane tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Frank came to stand beside him, his gaze following Bill's. "They'll be back," he said quietly, the statement hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Bill nodded. "And next time, they'll bring everything they've got." The other veterans gathered around, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flashlights they carried. Charlie leaned on a rusted shovel, his expression grim. "We made our point tonight," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But I don't think it's going to be enough." "It never is," Bill replied, his voice steady. "Men like that don't understand reason, they only understand strength." Frank glanced around at the group, his brow furrowed. "We need to make sure we're ready when they come back." "We will be," Bill said. He turned to face the group, his eyes scanning their faces, each lined with years of hard-earned wisdom. "We've faced worse than this. We've fought for things that matter, and we're gonna do it again." The men nodded in agreement, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. These were men who had faced death and returned home to tell the tale. They had lived through hell, and they weren't about to let a gang of thugs tear apart the peace they had fought so hard to protect. As the group began to disperse, Frank placed a hand on Bill's shoulder. "You sure about this?" Bill met his gaze. "We don't have a choice." The following morning dawned bright and clear, but the tension in Meadowbrook was palpable. Word of the confrontation at the warehouse had spread quickly, and the town's residents were on edge. People locked their doors, kept their children close, and watched the streets with wary eyes. The peaceful, idyllic town was gone, replaced by a community bracing for a storm. Sarah stood on the front porch, her arms crossed over her chest, as she watched Bill work in the garden. His movements were slow but steady, his cane resting against the fence as he pulled weeds from the flower beds. "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of frustration and fear. Bill straightened, wiping his hands on his pants before picking up his cane. "Do what?" "Put yourself in danger, rally the others, turn this town into a battleground." Bill sighed, leaning on his cane as he walked toward her. "Sarah, this isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about protecting what's ours." Sarah shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "I just don't want to lose you." "You won't," Bill said softly. "I've been through worse." Sarah looked away, her jaw tightening. "Maybe you have, but we haven't." Bill placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm not doing this alone. We're all in this together." Sarah nodded reluctantly, wiping away a tear. "Just be careful." "I will," Bill promised. Later that day, the veterans gathered once more at the old church on the edge of town. The building was weathered and worn, its paint peeling and its windows streaked with dirt. But it stood as a symbol of unity and resilience, a place where the community had come together in times of need. Inside, the men sat in a circle, their expressions serious. "We've got to be smart about this," Frank said, leaning forward in his chair. "They're going to come back, and they're going to come hard." Charlie nodded. "We've already got watch points set up around town. We'll know when they're coming." "That's good," Bill said, "but we need more than just eyes. We need a plan." The group fell silent for a moment, each man lost in thought. Then, slowly, ideas began to take shape. They discussed strategies, fallback points, and ways to protect the vulnerable members of the community. They planned for every scenario they could think of, drawing on their years of experience in combat. By the time the meeting ended, the men felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just defending their town, they were defending their way of life. The first sign of trouble came 2 nights later. Bill was sitting on his porch, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the lawn. He sipped his tea slowly, his gaze never straying far from the road. Suddenly, he heard it. The distant rumble of motorcycles. His grip on his cane tightened as he set his cup down and stood. Frank appeared moments later, his face set in a grim expression. "They're coming." Bill nodded. "How many?" "Too many," Frank replied. "They've brought reinforcements." The veterans quickly took their positions, their movements quiet and efficient. They had prepared for this moment, and now it was time to put their plan into action. The motorcycles roared into town, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The Iron Vultures were back, and this time, they weren't holding back. Grizzly led the pack, his eyes gleaming with a mix of anger and determination. As they reached the center of town, the bikers dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel. Grizzly surveyed the quiet streets, a sneer on his face. "Come on out, old man," he called, his voice echoing through the night. "Let's finish this." Bill stepped out of the shadows, his cane tapping against the pavement as he approached. The other. Veterans followed, their expressions cold and unyielding. "You didn't listen," Bill said, his voice calm but firm. "I told you to leave." Grizzly chuckled darkly. "And I told you this wasn't over." The tension in the air was thick, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the first punch was thrown. The street erupted into chaos as the 2 groups clashed once more. The veterans fought with the same determination and precision that had carried them through battles long past. They moved as a unit, covering each other's backs and holding the line. The bikers, fueled by anger and arrogance, fought with reckless aggression. But for every swing they took, the veterans had a counter. For every advance they made, the veterans pushed them back. Bill found himself face to face with Grizzly once more. The 2 men circled each other, their eyes locked. "You've got guts, old man," Grizzly said, a twisted grin on his face. "I'll give you that." Bill didn't respond. He simply swung his cane, the wood connecting with Grizzly's ribs with a sickening crack. Grizzly stumbled back, clutching his side. "You should have left," Bill said quietly. Grizzly growled, lunging forward. The 2 men grappled, their movements slow but deliberate. It was a battle of will, a test of strength and endurance. As the fight raged on, the bikers began to falter. One by one, they were overpowered by the veterans, their confidence shattered. Finally, Grizzly called for a retreat. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. But as they sped off into the night, it was clear that their spirit had been broken. The veterans stood victorious once more, their expressions weary but resolute. Frank turned to Bill, a faint smile on his face. "We did it." Bill nodded slowly. "For now." The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Meadowbrook had sent a clear message to the Iron Vultures, but Bill knew it wouldn't be the last time they'd have to fight. The town had stood strong, but it would take more than one victory to keep the peace. As Bill stood on his porch once more, his gaze fixed on the horizon, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his town. He was fighting for his family, for his friends, for everything he held dear. And he wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and gasoline as the veterans stood silently, watching the bikers retreat into the night. Their heavy boots crunched against the gravel, and the distant roar of engines echoed through the quiet town. The iron vultures had been beaten back again, but everyone knew it wasn't the last they would see of them. Frank wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning on his baseball bat as he caught his breath. "They won't let this go, Bill. Men like that never do." Bill nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the horizon where the bikers had disappeared. "I know, but every time they come back, we'll be here waiting." Charlie limped over, favoring his left leg, where a biker's crowbar had caught him during the fight. "We've given them 2 black eyes already," he said, his voice gruff. "But they're not going to walk away from this without trying to save face." "They'll come with more men," Frank added. "Maybe guns next time." Bill's jaw tightened. He had seen what desperation could drive men to do. He knew the Iron Vultures weren't just a group of rowdy troublemakers. They were predators, and they didn't like to be made fools of. "We'll be ready," Bill said firmly. "This is our town. We're not giving it up without a fight." The men nodded in agreement, the bond between them growing stronger with every skirmish. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a unit, a band of brothers who had come together to protect their home. As the veterans dispersed, heading back to their homes to clean up and rest, Bill lingered on his porch, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew the fight wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until the Iron Vultures were gone for good. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with concern. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "For now," Bill replied. Sarah glanced down the street, where a few of the veterans were still gathered, their voices low as they talked strategy. "You're going to keep fighting, aren't you?" Bill nodded. "We don't have a choice." Sarah's gaze dropped to the ground. "I just don't understand why it has to be you. You've done enough, Grandpa. You've given enough." Bill reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's not about what I've done. It's about what I can still do. This town is my home. It's your home. It's where my family is. And I'll do whatever it takes to keep it safe." Tears glistened in Sarah's eyes, but she nodded, understanding in her expression. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Bill said softly. "I've lived through worse." The night passed quietly, but the tension in the air remained. Bill sat by the window, watching the street, his cane resting across his lap. His mind drifted back to the war, long nights spent in foxholes, waiting for the next attack, never knowing if he'd make it to see the dawn. It felt the same now. The enemy was different, but the stakes were just as high. The next morning, the town of Meadowbrook began to stir. People went about their routines cautiously, casting nervous glances down the street, where the signs of the previous night's battle were still visible. Broken bottles littered the ground, and the faint smell of burned rubber lingered in the air. Bill stood on his porch, his sharp eyes scanning the street. He knew the town was watching him. They saw him as a leader, a protector, and he wouldn't let them down. Frank arrived with a thermos of coffee, handing it to Bill as he joined him on the porch. "You sleep at all?" he asked. Bill shook his head. "Didn't feel right." Frank nodded in understanding. "We've got more men willing to step up. A few of the younger guys from the hardware store said they'd help keep watch." "Good," Bill said. "We'll need all the help we can get." As they sipped their coffee in silence, a car pulled up in front of the house. The sheriff, Tom Wheeler, stepped out, adjusting his hat as he approached the porch. "Morning, Bill, Frank," he said with a nod. "Sheriff," Bill replied, his tone neutral. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Heard there was trouble again last night." "There was," Bill said simply. The sheriff frowned. "I appreciate what you're doing, but you know you're walking a fine line here. This isn't the war anymore, Bill. You can't just take the law into your own hands." Bill's gaze hardened. "With all due respect, Sheriff, the law hasn't done much to stop them." "We're doing what we can," Tom said defensively. "But these guys aren't just some local punks. They're a gang. They've got connections." "And we've got each other," Bill replied. This town has always taken care of its own. We're not about to stop now. The sheriff sighed again, clearly frustrated. Just be careful, all right? I don't want to see anyone get hurt. Bill nodded, but his expression didn't soften. We will be. Tom hesitated for a moment before turning and walking back to his car. As he drove away, Frank glanced at Bill. You think he'll get in our way? No, Bill said. He's just covering his ass. He knows we're right. Frank chuckled. Yeah, but that doesn't mean he likes it. That afternoon, a few more veterans gathered at Bill's house. They sat around the kitchen table, discussing their next steps. Charlie spread out a map of Meadowbrook, marking key points where they could set up watch stations. We'll need eyes on all the main roads, he said. If they come back, we need to see them before they get into town. Bill nodded. We'll also need to keep an eye on the warehouse. That's their base of operations. Frank leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. What about supplies? We've got weapons, but nothing serious. If they come back with guns... Bill's expression darkened. We'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, we focus on keeping them out. The men continued to strategize, their plans growing more detailed and coordinated. They weren't just reacting anymore. They were preparing. As the sun began to set, Bill stood on his porch once more, his cane tapping against the wooden boards. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. But there was no peace in Meadowbrook tonight. The storm was coming, and everyone knew it. Frank joined him, lighting a cigarette as he leaned against the railing. Think we got a chance? Bill nodded slowly. We've got more than a chance. We've got something worth fighting for. Frank exhaled a cloud of smoke, his gaze distant. They'll hit us hard next time. I know, Bill said quietly. The two men stood in silence, the weight of what was to come pressing heavily on their shoulders. But they didn't waver. They had faced worse before, and they would face it again. As the first stars appeared in the sky, the distant rumble of engines reached their ears. They're coming, Frank said. Bill's grip on his cane tightened. Then let's meet them. The bikers didn't come in quietly this time. They roared into town with their engines revving, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The iron vultures were back, and they were making sure everyone knew it. Bill and Frank stepped off the porch, joining the other veterans as they took their positions. The town had been waiting for this moment. They were ready. Grizzly led the pack once more, his beard glinting in the moonlight as he pulled his bike to a stop in the center of town. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he surveyed the street. "Where's the old man?" he called, his voice echoing through the night. Bill stepped forward, his cane tapping steadily against the pavement. The other veterans followed, their expressions cold and determined. "I'm right here," Bill said. Grizzly sneered. "Still standing, huh? You've got guts. I'll give you that." Bill's gaze didn't waver. "This is your last chance. Leave now and don't come back." Grizzly chuckled darkly. "And if we don't?" Bill took another step forward, his cane clicking against the ground. "Then you'll find out what happens when you mess with men who have nothing left to lose." The tension in the air was electric. The two sides faced off once more, the battle lines drawn. This time, there would be no retreat. The sound of the Iron Vulture's motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook, louder and more menacing than before. The air vibrated with the roar of engines, the acrid scent of exhaust fumes lingering like a warning. Grizzly and his gang had returned, and this time, they weren't holding back. Bill stood in the middle of Maplewood Drive, his cane resting lightly in his hand. His gaze was steady, his expression unyielding. The other veterans flanked him, their faces grim but resolute. They were outnumbered, severely outnumbered, but none of them flinched. They had faced worse odds before. Frank stepped up beside Bill, his baseball bat resting on his shoulder. "You ready for this?" Bill nodded. "Been ready." The bikers dismounted, their boots hitting the pavement with heavy thuds. Grizzly led the way, his beard glinting in the dim streetlights. His expression was twisted with rage, his eyes burning with the need to reclaim the power he'd lost. Behind him, the other bikers spread out, forming a loose semicircle around the veterans. Grizzly stopped a few feet away from Bill, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Bill's grip on his cane tightened. "Neither do you." Grizzly chuckled darkly. "I gotta admit, You've got balls, old man. But this ends tonight. Bill didn't blink. You're right, it does. For a moment, the street was silent, save for the distant hum of the remaining motorcycles. The two groups stared each other down, tension crackling in the air like a live wire. Grizzly took a step closer. You really think a bunch of old war dogs can take us on? We already have, Frank said, his voice calm. Twice. Grizzly's smirk faltered for a split second before he masked it with bravado. Yeah, well, third time's the charm. Bill stepped forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. This isn't about charm, son. It's about knowing when you're beat. Grizzly's eyes darkened. We're not beat. No? Bill raised an eyebrow. Then why'd you bring more men this time? Why come back with reinforcements if you're not afraid? Grizzly growled, taking another step forward. I'm not afraid of you. Bill held his ground. Maybe not, but you should be afraid of what you've started. The veterans behind Bill moved in unison, stepping closer, their makeshift weapons at the ready. They didn't need to say a word. Their presence alone was enough to send a message. These were men who had seen hell and come back stronger. They weren't about to back down now. Grizzly glanced around, his bravado starting to crack. The Iron Vultures might have had the numbers, but they didn't have the discipline or the experience of the veterans standing before them. And deep down, Grizzly knew it. One of the younger bikers, Snake, stepped forward, a crowbar in his hand. Let's just finish this already, he snarled. Bill's gaze shifted to Snake, his expression cold. Go ahead, make your move. Snake hesitated, his grip on the crowbar tightening, but something in Bill's eyes made him stop. There was no fear there, no hesitation, just quiet, unshakable resolve. Grizzly growled in frustration. Enough of this! He turned to his men. Take them down! The bikers surged forward, weapons in hand, but the veterans were ready. Frank swung his bat, catching the first biker in the ribs and sending him sprawling to the ground. Charlie used his shovel to knock another biker off his feet, while Bill moved with surprising speed, using his cane to deflect blows and strike back with precision. The street erupted into chaos. The sounds of shouting, grunting, and the clanging of metal filled the air. The two groups clashed in a brutal dance of strength and strategy, each side fighting for control of the town. Bill moved through the fray with practiced ease, his mind calm and focused. He had been in battles before, real battles, where the stakes were life and death. This was no different. He knew how to keep his head, how to anticipate his opponent's moves, how to strike with precision. Grizzly came at him with a knife, the blade flashing in the dim light. Bill sidestepped the attack, using his cane to knock the knife from Grizzly's hand. The knife clattered to the pavement, and Grizzly stumbled, his eyes wide with shock. You've lost, Bill said, his voice steady. Walk away. Grizzly snarled, lunging at Bill with a roar, but Bill was ready. He swung his cane, the wood connecting with Grizzly's jaw with a sickening crack. Grizzly crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. The other bikers faltered, their confidence shaken. They hadn't expected this. They thought they were coming to intimidate, to reclaim their dominance. Instead, they found themselves outmatched by a group of men who refused to give up. Snake, still clutching his crowbar, looked around at the fallen bikers and the determined veterans. His bravado evaporated, replaced by fear. Let's go, he muttered to the others. We're done here. One by one, the bikers began to retreat, climbing back onto their motorcycles. The roar of engines filled the air once more as they sped off into the night, their tails between their legs. As the last motorcycle disappeared into the distance, the veterans let out a collective sigh of relief. The battle was over, for now. Frank walked over to Bill, a grin on his face. Well, I'd say we sent a pretty clear message. Bill nodded, his expression calm but serious. Let's hope it sticks. Back in the quiet of his home, Bill sat by the window, staring out at the dark street. The town was peaceful again, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Iron Vultures might have retreated, but they weren't gone for good. Men like Grizzly didn't give up that easily. Sarah came into the room, her expression soft. Grandpa? Bill turned to her, a faint smile on his face. Everything all right? She nodded. The kids are asleep. Bill gestured for her to sit beside him. Good. Sarah sat down, her hands clasped in her lap, She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you think it's really over?" Bill shook his head. "No, but it's a start." Sarah frowned. "I don't understand why they keep coming back. Why can't they just leave us alone?" Bill sighed. "Because men like that thrive on fear. They take what they want because they think no one will stand up to them." "But we did," Sarah said. "You did." Bill nodded. "And that's why they'll keep coming. They need to prove they're still in control." Sarah looked down at her hands. "So, what do we do?" Bill placed a hand on her shoulder. "We keep standing. We keep fighting. And we show them that Meadowbrook isn't a town that rolls over." Sarah smiled faintly. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Bill chuckled. "Runs in the family." The days passed quietly, but the town remained on edge. The veterans continued their patrols, keeping watch over the streets and the main roads leading into town. They knew the Iron Vultures weren't gone for good. They were just waiting for their next opportunity. Bill spent his days on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the signs to look for: the distant rumble of engines, the shadows moving at the edge of town. He had been a soldier once, and that part of him never left. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank arrived with Charlie and a few of the other veterans. They gathered on Bill's porch, their expressions serious. "We've got word," Frank said quietly. "They're regrouping, and this time, they're bringing more." Bill's jaw tightened. "How many?" "Too many," Charlie replied. "We can't take them head on?" Bill nodded slowly. "Then we don't." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What's the plan?" Bill's gaze hardened. "We draw them in, we make them think they've won, and when they least expect it, we show them that Meadowbrook doesn't fall." The veterans began to prepare, working quietly and efficiently. They reinforced their defenses, set up lookout points, and planned their next moves. The town might have been outnumbered, but it wasn't outmatched. They had something the Iron Vultures didn't: unity, experience, and a determination to protect what was theirs. As night fell, Bill stood on his porch, his cane in hand. The distant sound of engines reached his ears, growing louder with each passing moment. "They're coming," he said softly. Frank stepped up beside him, his baseball bat resting on his shoulder. "Let's finish this." Bill nodded, his expression unyielding. "Let's." The night stretched long and heavy over Meadowbrook, wrapping the town in silence that felt more like a threat than a comfort. Inside his modest clapboard house, Bill Carter sat at the kitchen table, his hands clasped around a mug of cold coffee. His cane leaned against the wall beside him, and his gaze was distant, locked on something far beyond the confines of the room. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah had put the kids to bed hours ago, and now she stood by the window, peeking through the curtains at the empty street. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards made her flinch, her heart pounding in her chest. "They'll be back, won't they?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Bill didn't answer right away. He knew the truth, but saying it out loud made it too real. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, they'll be back." Sarah sighed, pressing her forehead against the glass. "Why? Why can't they just leave us alone?" "Because men like that only understand one thing." Bill stood slowly, the ache in his joints making his movements deliberate. He picked up his cane and tapped it against the floor. "Power. They think they can take what they want because they've never been stopped. Until now." Sarah turned to him, worry etched into her features. "And now that you've stopped them, they're coming for you." Bill met her gaze, his steel-gray eyes unflinching. "They're coming for all of us." Before Sarah could respond, a sound cut through the stillness of the night. A distant, low rumble. It was faint at first, barely audible over the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. But Bill knew that sound all too well. Motorcycles. They were coming. Bill walked to the front door, opening it just enough to step out onto the porch. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of exhaust fumes. He stood there, listening as the rumble grew louder, closer. The Iron Vultures weren't sneaking in this time. They wanted to be heard. "They're here," Bill said quietly. Sarah's face went pale. "Oh God, what do we do?" "We do what we've been doing." Bill's voice was calm, steady. "We stand." Sarah's lips trembled, but she nodded. "I'll get the kids." Bill stepped off the porch and into the yard. Across the street, he saw movement. His neighbors, his comrades, stepping out of their homes, weapons in hand. Frank was already there, his baseball bat slung over his shoulder, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Showtime," Frank muttered, blowing out a cloud of smoke. Bill nodded. "Let's finish this." The motorcycles came into view, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of some monstrous beast. The iron vultures rode in slowly, deliberately, their engines snarling like predators circling their prey. There were more of them this time, at least 20 riders, maybe more. Grizzly led the pack, his beard bristling in the wind, his eyes locked on Bill. When the bikers reached the center of town, they stopped. Engines cut out one by one, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Grizzly dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel. He took a long, deliberate look around, taking in the sight of the veterans standing side by side, waiting for him. "Well, well," Grizzly said, his voice carrying through the night. "You old bastards don't know when to quit, do you?" Frank spat on the ground. "Neither do you." Grizzly smirked. "You're right, I don't." He took a step forward, his hands resting casually on his belt. "But this time, we're not here to mess around. This time, we're here to take what's ours." Bill's grip on his cane tightened. "Nothing here is yours." Grizzly chuckled. "That's where you're wrong, old man. This town belongs to us now. You just don't realize it yet." Bill took a slow step forward, his cane tapping against the pavement. "No, it doesn't. It belongs to the people who live here, and we're not giving it up." Grizzly's smirk faded. His eyes hardened. "You think you can stop us?" Bill nodded. "We already have." Grizzly's gaze swept over the veterans, his jaw tightening. He could see it in their eyes. The resolve, the determination. These weren't men who would be scared off by threats. They had seen war. They had lived through hell, and they weren't about to let a gang of thugs take their home. Grizzly took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "All right then, let's see what you've got." The bikers surged forward, weapons in hand, crowbars, chains, knives, all aimed at the veterans who stood their ground. The street erupted into chaos once more, a brutal clash of wills and strength. Frank swung his bat, knocking one biker off his feet. Charlie used his shovel to fend off another. The veterans moved with precision, covering each other's backs, their makeshift weapons striking with practiced efficiency. Bill found himself face to face with Grizzly, the two men circling each other like predators. Grizzly lunged, his fists swinging wildly, but Bill was calm, deliberate. He dodged the attack, using his cane to knock Grizzly off balance. "You should have left when you had the chance," Bill said. Grizzly growled, regaining his footing. "And you should have stayed out of this." The fight raged on, but it was clear that the iron vultures were faltering. They hadn't expected this level of resistance. They thought they were dealing with scared civilians, easy targets. Instead, they found themselves up against men who had been forged in the crucible of war. One by one, the bikers began to fall back, their confidence shattered. Grizzly looked around, realizing his crew was retreating. His jaw clenched in frustration. "You haven't won!" he snarled. Bill took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Haven't we?" Grizzly glared at him, his chest heaving. "You think this is over?" Bill nodded slowly. "I know it is." With a growl of frustration, Grizzly turned and stormed back to his bike. He mounted it, revving the engine. "This isn't the last you've seen of us." Bill watched as Grizzly sped off into the night, the remaining bikers following him. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a quiet, empty street. Frank walked over to Bill, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Think that's the last of them?" Bill sighed. "No, but they won't be back for a long time." Frank grinned. "Good, gives us time to rest." As the veterans began to disperse, Bill stood alone for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The fight was over, for now. But he knew the battle for Meadowbrook would never truly end. Sarah stepped out of the house, her eyes scanning the street. "Is it over?" Bill turned to her, a faint smile on his face. "For tonight." Sarah walked over, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you." Bill hugged her tightly, his voice soft. "We do what we have to." As the first light of dawn broke over the town, Bill stood on his porch, watching the sun rise. Meadowbrook was safe again. And as long as he and the other veterans stood together, it always would be.